Good evening, and thanks for joining us tonight for supported decision making and alternatives to guardianship. My name is Deborah Fiasco, and I am with the Family and Community Engagement Division. Uh, just want to go over a couple of housekeeping things for us tonight. That this webinar is being recorded, and your camera and microphone have been disabled. You can ask questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and chat is messages between participants has been limited. So webinars, while the screens are turned off and the microphones and the questions, we can't always guarantee confidentiality. And so please don't share any identifiable or specific information about your family member or your student. If you require additional assistance, please chat with the host. Closed captioning has been activated, and a recording of this webinar will begin in about a week, will be available in about a week. So I'm just going to introduce you to my wonderful Family and Community Engagement Division. So our mission is to partner with students, family, and staff to support students' specialized academic, social, emotional needs, and to promote self-determination, which is we're really going to get into that tonight, equitable opportunities, and authentic inclusion. Tonight we have with us, we're really thankful to have Will Hack with us, a staff attorney with Missouri Protection and Advocacy. He's an awesome guy and just an expert on this topic. So thank you so much, Will, for joining us, and I'm going to let you take over.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to discussing with y'all a little bit about supported decision making, which may be a new topic to many people, and alternatives to guardianship. So, ways for our young people to make decisions without needing to resort to the courts. So, I'll start out with a little bit about myself on this next slide. I work for an organization called Missouri Protection and Advocacy Services, and we provide free legal and advocacy services to individuals with disabilities. I'll have some contact information at the end of this presentation, but feel free to reach out to me with any questions and reach out to our organization with any disability related issues, regardless of whether they're related to alternatives to guardianship. I am a leader in the Supported Decision Making Consortium, which is a group that works to promote supported decision making throughout the state. And here you can see my wife and my son, Mendel. He is 4 years old now, and I'm wearing a bolo tie with an M on it today in his honor. And there's just a little bit more information about me. We have a lot of pets in our house, as you can see at this particular moment. Next, I will talk a little bit about our objectives today. We're going to learn about supported decision making and discuss that transition from youth to adulthood, especially among people and individuals that may not know exactly how they're going to be making decisions moving forward. I'll also hope to help you understand more other alternatives to guardianship as well, as supported decision making is only one part of our toolbox. In the state of Missouri, whenever a person transitions at the age of 18, we have really kind of a sudden jump, and this is true in many states, where you go from a parent making all decisions for a child and having all of those legal rights to suddenly turning 18, and now that adult gets to make all of their own decisions. That can be very abrupt, and so we try to prepare for that in advance. And so that's one thing we'll talk about today with that transition. And when an individual turns 18 years old and has a disability that could make it difficult for them to make their own decisions, there are many different options we can look to help with that decision making. On this slide, this just goes over briefly what those different options are. Of course, you could have nothing in place, and that may be appropriate depending on an individual. You could use supported decision making, which could be something that's very informal or something that's more formal. There are powers of attorney, which are documents that are more formal and legalistic, which we'll go over as well. And then there's guardianship, which is the most restrictive option and involves somebody making decisions for the person instead of them making their own decisions. Each of these is a legal option, so there can be different requirements for how that's going to be enforced or how you're going to use this type of decision making. For most people, we may not have ever thought about this question before. Including people with disabilities, most people can make their own decisions without requiring help. But it can still be useful advice, to think things over and consult with other people that you trust before deciding. I'll say in my own life, I do a significant amount of what I would call informal supported decision making, where while I'm making my own decisions, I do consult with other people to make sure I kind of know what I'm talking about. And when I don't know what I'm talking about, what to try. So we'll start out then talking about supported decision making itself. And while there's no, I wouldn't say there's a very formal definition, this next slide discusses what that looks like. While there's no one size fits all model of supported decision making, it occurs when people choose their trusted friends, family members, and professionals. So that's three different sets of people that you trust: your friends, people in your family, and people who are professionally there to help you, to understand the situations and choices they face so they make their own decisions. Supported decision making is not about someone else making decisions for me, it's about me making decisions with help. And again, you may not have thought about it before, but you would be using supported decision making whenever you seek advice, including from a mechanic, a doctor, a financial advisor, a personal trainer, a lawyer like me. I ask other lawyers when I have legal questions, or anybody else. And here we have some pictures of my son in various different careers that he's considered, that he would ask other people for advice before taking on. We've decided upon a few different principles for supported decision making. And this is something that, as a supported decision making consortium, we talked about, and other people across the country and across the globe have talked about what it really means to use supported decision making. And we've came up with these. These are just some of the principles that are kind of the foundation. That everyone has the right to make their own decisions and direct their own lives to the maximum of their abilities, that people can ask for and receive help making decisions without us assuming that they can't make decisions. And in fact, I strongly believe that everyone should ask for help anytime that you have some questions about the decisions you're making. That should not then mean we take away your right to make those decisions. That means you're using some foresight. And there are as many different ways to give and get help as there are people. It's individualized, and every different person has a different way of making decisions. So you might ask, why should we use supported decision making? Now, this new concept that we're talking about. Well, there is some research backing, and it talks about self-determination, that which is when people make their own choices and determine what happens in their own lives instead of other people deciding what happens for them. The studies have shown that essentially you're healthier if you're able to make your own decisions and given that opportunity. And you'll see on this slide, we talk about when you're denied self determination, then you feel less helpless, hopeless, self critical, and you have less ability to function. But on the next slide, they've also found the inverse, that people with greater self determination are healthier, more independent, better adjusted, and more integrated into their communities. One that perhaps is a bit counterintuitive to people who are used to our guardianship system is that studies also show that people who are able to make their own decisions are better able to recognize and resist abuse. So that's one theme I'll talk about today, is that guardianship doesn't prevent abuse. And to the extent that we can help people make their own decisions, that is helpful for people to be able to avoid abuse and neglect. Supported decision making in a practical context, I'm saying these things. What does that actually look like if I want to start practicing supported decision making with my son or with my family member, someone I support? And I would recommend starting small. On this next slide, you see one of a very early decision that I let my son work on. We went to the grocery store and he saw a pickle in a bag. He does not like pickles. I already knew that. But at the grocery store, he was insistent that he really wanted to try this pickle. So I said, all right. We bought it, we brought it home, we tried it. You can see him tasting it here, and you see in that final picture immediately before he threw the pickle, as he did not like it, as predicted. But that was a great opportunity for him to learn. And that's one where we started small and we practiced making a decision where it was okay for him to make a mistake, and that wasn't going to make a major difference in his life. Making that kind of mistake helped him learn. And so we have in the past gone to the grocery store now and thought, hey, we tried this food before. We didn't like it. Now we know not to get it. And these are some foods that we do like. We know to try those. When we're starting out, we also want to be asking why I'm making this decision. So during the process, I think all of us have instincts, and those instincts sometimes are right and sometimes they lead us astray. So we can actually think about it as we're making the decision. And then I think it's very important to review the decision afterwards, especially when something goes wrong, because then we can look and see why things maybe didn't go the way we anticipated and really learn from that experience. In order to get started with supported decision making, you don't need a great deal of things. There aren't a lot of materials, and I'll go over some extra resources that you can use. But really, all that you need are somebody that you can trust to talk through your decision with. Again, that could be a friend, that could be a family member, that could be my doctor, more often than not, whenever I have a medical issue. I need information that I can understand, so it won't be especially helpful to me if someone hands me a document that's full of medical terms and medical language. It's going to be more useful if someone sits down and talks to me using simple medical terms that make sense and meet me where I'm at, and the opportunity to research before making that decision. I put research in scare quotes here because that can just mean going on Google and doing a few searches. It doesn't have to be something extremely involved. But before I make a decision, I want to have an opportunity to think about it and look over my options. And finally, I need a way to safely communicate my decision. So I need to not be scared before I share what I've decided, and to trust that the people I'm sharing this decision with will take me seriously. For our school-aged kids, I think a great time to practice supported decision making is during the IEP. I encourage my kid, and he's only 4, he can't participate too much, but we can bring him to parent-teacher conferences, to his IEP meetings, and say, "What are your goals for school? What do you like at school, and what do you dislike?" And that's the first step to him making his own decisions. I think that as we continue through the IEP process for my family, and I'd encourage every family and the families that I work with as attorneys to have their child participate as much as they reasonably can with that process, and to share what they're struggling with and what their goals are, not just what my goals are for my child. And again, I think that for lots of children, that can get to be too much eventually. So we just meet our kids where they're at. And when that is too much, step out and we can continue the IEP process without them. Supported decision making that I've been describing is largely an informal process. We can do this without getting any forms or writing anything in front of us by just asking questions. For me personally, again, when I'm thinking about where I should bank, I ask my parents. This was a major decision for me when I was moving from Missouri to Michigan and to the District of Columbia. I had to switch banks several times. I had no idea what I was doing just going into college. So that was certainly an area where I benefited from people that I trusted to help me decide what bank to go to. I'm really glad I did, seeing some of what my wife has experienced choosing a bank that didn't really value her. The same goes for choosing a dentist. I talk to my friends and see what dentists they've seen. When it comes to questions about insurance and medical decisions, I'm going to talk to the people that know about those things rather than trying myself to wade through documents that I don't really understand. And I continue to ask these questions. These are just a few of them until I'm ready, until I've decided on something and I'm ready to articulate that choice. So here I have on the next couple slides just a few ideas for practicing decisions, especially for young people. You can practice these decisions with very low stakes so that you'll be ready when the stakes get higher. You can start out with, like we discussed, trying a new food. Should I try it or should I not? And graduate up to choosing an entire lunch menu and trying to make sure I get options that are going to fill me up and be healthy for me. And then scheduling my meal times, a skill that I really should have worked on before college, and then I ate exclusively dinner, whatever, one time a day. That was not a good choice, and I could have used that practice. The same goes for spending money. I have practiced this again with my son, being like, here's what money is, trying to get that concept across to him. And then as we get older, I'm going to go to, I think, exactly what I've laid out here, starting to have an allowance, Here's $5 you can spend. You're not going to be able to spend very much. And it's not going to be a danger if you spend your $5 inappropriately, but you're going to start to learn this is the value of money and this is how far it goes. Finally, I think that what can be really difficult as we transition to adulthood is how I can spend money to make it last through a whole day. If I have $25 for all my meals today and I spend all of that before noon, it's going to be a really tough day. So, practicing those things can lead to being ready when I turn 18, when my son turns 18. And for a lot of different individuals that don't get this practice in advance, you can work on this before that transition occurs. The same goes for education and healthcare. Here are just some more examples that I'll go over really quickly. In terms of classes, when should I schedule doing my homework? What classes I should take each semester? I think it becomes a difficult question when I graduate. Should I go to college? Should I start working? Should I find a day program for myself? Those are questions I want to practice before the moment that I have to make them. And then in terms of my health, it's really important when I take my medicine each day. That's a decision that I can make that doesn't have a huge consequence if I'm going to take it in the morning or the evening for most of my medications. But it's one that I can make in preparation for more difficult questions of who do I trust to help me make medical decisions? How am I going to keep track of my appointments that I can't afford to miss? So, drawing the line can be very difficult. And for me, what I try to get across to families and individuals that I work with is that people can make decisions we don't agree with. And that doesn't mean they're not able to make decisions. We all have to make mistakes in order to learn. And the same goes for just because a decision was good for me when I was growing up or even today, doesn't mean that is going to be the best decision for my family member. And finally, some decisions are so difficult, they don't have a single right answer. And that's something that I do struggle with families that I represent. When an individual makes a decision they don't agree with, sometimes it's difficult to make decisions. And those decisions are going to look different for every person. You don't have to do all of this alone. There are a lot of great resources out there. I would highly recommend this first one, the Life Course. They have tons of different documents and planners and ways to get started. Here's just a few on this slide that I don't know if you can see it very easily, but this is on planning and tracking your goals and the integrated support star, which I think are great starting places. But again, there are a ton of different resources on their website, which you can see the link to as well. I personally recommend the tools on the next page as well. I use this Habitica, which is just because I'm a gamer kind of guy. You saw on the slide, I love to play board games. So this is just an app on my phone that has different tasks I need to accomplish throughout the day and throughout the week, and I check them off as I go. And it's all got a sheen over it of being like a great fantasy adventure. But that kind of just preps my brain to think I'm doing what I want to be doing and I'm achieving my goals throughout the day. I just introduced that particular tool to my 4-year-old, and he loves it. It makes a little bleep bloop sound whenever we achieve one of our goals. So, for any individual that's having a hard time keeping track of all the things we need to do throughout the day, I would highly recommend that or similar tools. And then financial tools, Rocket Money is just one such tool, but it has a good way of tracking different subscriptions. So the fact that I've been playing for Netflix and Paramount Plus and all the other things, I can see what I'm spending and not using is really valuable. And I think that it has a lot of different tools if you're wanting to engage with them. So those are just a couple of different free options to get started with. Then, if you want to do some more formal versions of supported decision making, there are options available to do that as well. For me, I do this with individuals that are worried about guardianship because in the state of Missouri, guardianship is supposed to be the last option for individuals. And if they can be supported in making their own decisions with supported decision making agreements or powers of attorney or anything else, then that needs to be considered before we go to guardianship. So at that point, I would say, if you're worried about it, let's go ahead and write all this down. We are going to write down who is being assisted and what supports I need for my decision making, trying to be as specific as possible. We're going to talk about what supports are already in place and what people I already trust, and then what people we also can bring on board, again, that I trust to help me make my own decisions. We're going to get those with the signatures. And again, if it's getting to the point where we're going to court, we may actually file this document. But to begin with, this is just something we're going to write down so we have a plan. And I would encourage you to think about a formal supported decision making agreement as a plan for making decisions. When we're creating it, I do kind of look at it as getting all my frogs in a row. We're going to identify what the long term goals, wants, needs, and abilities are of the person being supported. So it's not me as a parent, what I'm trying to impose upon my son or my daughter or another person I'm supporting. It's not me as a support worker. It's me as an individual that's going to be filling out this document. My son is the one someday that's going to fill out a supported decision making agreement and say, these are the things that I want and need. This is what I want to achieve. And here's how I view my abilities. And my supporters are going to help me with that. It's going to include some decisions that I can make without help and some decisions that I do want help with. And I think it's very important anytime we're going to put something in writing to include what principles I'm using to help me make those decisions. I've certainly worked with a lot of individuals that made their decisions based on their culture and their religious preferences. And it's a little bit disheartening when I go and talk to somebody to make a plan and nobody's ever asked them these questions. An individual, especially individuals as they're getting older, people may not be familiar with their preferences. And that's very sad. So it's very important to me to get these down in writing. And then when I'm looking over the supported decision making document with new people, they'll know where I'm coming from. We'll also include specifically who we want to make decisions. So as an individual, it's going to be the people that I trust, professionals, family members, and friends that agree to help me. I will say when I put available here, there's a reason for that because if your supported decision makers are all people that live several states away and you're going to have to call them 5 times on 5 different days to get a hold of them, that's not going to be the best situation for creating a supported decision making agreement. There are lots of different areas to consider. Today, we'll go over a formal decision making agreement for education, but most often I fill these out for individuals in terms of finances and medical decision making, because often that's how individuals get in touch with an attorney is they worry about how they're spending their money or their family members are worried about how they're spending their money or taking care of themselves. So those are the most common versions, but we also certainly can have those decision making for where I'm going to live and where I'm going to be employed. And for individuals at that transition age, education is critical. Some additional considerations, and I think this would go for whatever kind of decision making you're talking about, but certainly if you're filling out a supported decision making agreement, you're going to want to think about speech and language, the way that I communicate. Because if I'm meeting a new person and they don't know my primary method of communication is sign language, that's going to be a major barrier. It would be a great thing to have that already in my supported decision making agreement. Or if I need a lot of time to process before I make a decision, that's something I want to include as well. So I'm not pressured to make an instant decision when that's usually not required. We're going to talk about the interpersonal and social aspects of my life, any behavioral concerns. And I know people can be loath to talk about, what I do that I'm not proud of, but that's something that I encourage all of my clients to go ahead and include if they're aware of those concerns. Self-care, the way that I'm going to be taking care of my own life in my home day-to-day activities, to the extent that you plan those in advance, that can be great to include in your supported decision-making agreement. And the way that I organize my life. For me, again, that could be using that Habitica and apps to track the different things. Lots of people use grocery lists. That's just one very basic form. But whatever way that you approach making decisions in your life and organizing it, that is another great thing to include in your supported decision-making agreement. Just like any option for decision making, there are pros and cons. For me, as a major supporter of supported decision-making agreements, I think that allowing for such an individualized approach for an individual to make all their own decisions with the help that they want is a really major pro to this. And this is a reason why people choose supported decision-making over other decision-making options. It allows for so much autonomy, so much self-determination, which, as we talked about earlier in this presentation, is a great way for me to remain healthy and feel more in control of my life. And then there's also a great deal of flexibility with the supported decision making, whether that's an agreement or that's informal. I can make changes to that very easily without needing to go necessarily to an attorney or to a court or something like that. But there are also some cons. There are some reasons why you would choose another option at some point. This is still a relatively new concept in Missouri law. Supported decision making only became a part of our law in 2018. And there are still questions about how it's implemented, and how courts will view supported decision making, both informal and formal. And it is a little bit more time consuming than just winging it. I'll be honest, when I sit down to do a supported decision making agreement with somebody, I'm going to have multiple sessions. I'm going to sit down the first time for maybe an hour, go through some documents, do some understanding about an individual's perspective and their supporters' perspective in what decisions they already make and what they want to make. And then we're going to come back two or three more times to be sure, since you've come to me, an attorney, I'm going to do my job and make sure that we've really drilled down. So that can be a little bit more time consuming, although I'd say it's worth it most of the time. It is necessary for supported decision making for you to have reliable supporters, people that you can go to and know they're going to be there for you. And sometimes that can be the most difficult step. But I will say, in every area of your life, if you have people that support you, you're going to be doing better. So, well, I think that that can be difficult and it is a con. It's something that I encourage everyone to strive for. And one other question is, do you need the formality, especially if you're going to be sitting there and drafting a supported decision making agreement? Many individuals are able to make their own decisions without without an attorney getting involved, without an advocate getting involved, even. So you can ask yourself, how much do I need to take each of the steps along the way with supported decision making. And you can make that as specific as formal or informal, as written or verbal as is appropriate for your own situation. So here I'm going to give an example of an educational supported decision making agreement. I like to have versions that are both fill in the blank, and what we have here is just a simple checkbox version. So this is for some common questions that individuals have that they might want support with or not want support with. Here I include at the top whether I do or don't want support overall with educational decision making, and then include the individuals and their contact information. I think it's very useful to have that phone number in there. So if I'm handing my supported decision making agreement to a person for the first time, they can see exactly where to go, and exactly who does support me already. And then here, again, there's some specifics. Do I want this person to be able to access my educational information? As an attorney, we deal with FERPA releases, so we would have those signed in advance if we want someone to be able to access my records. So often, and I'm disappointed when I get a client that has this, an individual is told, look, you're turning 18. You need to get a guardianship for your parents to be able to see your medical records, your educational records, or participate in your IEP meetings. That's simply not true. And a supported decision making agreement or a power of attorney could be a great place to say, these people are my supporters. They can participate in those ways. Whether I want this individual to help me make decisions about whether I'm going to enroll in school and where I'm going to go to school. I will tell you there have been points in my life that I very much valued the opinion of my parents, and others where I did not want their opinion in what was going to be the next step with my life. And so this is one where you can really individualize it to say which people I want to be my supporters in this area. Making decisions about special education and attending IEP meetings, as we've just discussed, are both things that I may want supporters, and I may want very specific supporters and not other supporters. And finally, making decisions about participating in school activities and extracurriculars. My parents were not big fans about when I took up football in middle school. And they, I had to really convince them at that point that that's something that I wanted to do. Once you turn 18, you get to make those decisions without permission from your parents. So that can be a part where you say, here are the people that I do trust to help me make decisions. Here are people that I don't want to help me make decisions. And I can really drive my own decision making process. I always include these blanks at the end to add more specific information for if my client wants someone to help them with something that's not listed here or does not want help with something that's listed. One practical application to maybe drill home a little bit what we experience as we go through the process of supported decision making is that people grow and change. And as you get older, for many individuals turning 18, they're still developing their capacity. A person, when they turn 16 versus when they turn 18 versus when they turn 25, is going to be a different person. And I constantly have to remind myself of that with my son. When he was born, he had a lot of problems going on, and it was a very long time before he was ready to take some steps that other kids were able to make. But if I always think of him as he was when he was an infant or and early in his life, then I'm robbing him of the chance to grow and understand what his capacity is as he gets older. So with supported decision making, we can take the changes as they come and make changes to our supported decision making as we get new abilities, as we get new supporters, new people that we trust, and people that aren't a part of our lives anymore. Supported decision making is a great tool for reflecting that growing and changing capacity. So that's all I'm going to talk about for supported decision making as a option. We're going to move next to another very common option for decision making that's a little bit more formal called a power of attorney. In general, a power of attorney is a legal document. Unlike supported decision making, where only if you're going to file this with a court does it enter a legal arena, the power of attorney has kind of immediate legal effect once it's signed off on. It enables a person called the principal to choose someone else called an attorney in fact to act on their behalf. So I like to think of this in terms of me and my chooser. If I have somebody else that I want to make decisions for me, they're going to be my chooser. And the way that the law talks about it as attorney in fact is very confusing because that person doesn't have to be an attorney. My chooser could be my mom, it could be my wife, it could be my child. But I'm going to choose someone with this power of attorney to make decisions for me if a certain circumstance takes place. The most common power of attorney that I work with is the durable power of attorney, which is on the next slide. That's a written power of attorney where the authority of my chooser doesn't end when I become sick or I'm no longer able to make decisions for myself. So I'm going to want someone, if I'm drafting a document, to be able to make decisions for me when it's no longer possible for me to make my own decisions. This can be very useful if I know I'm getting sicker, or I mean, certainly if I'm getting very old and I'm worried about my decision making capacities and I'm continuing to age. But this is also very useful for individuals when they're young, when I'm worried that someday a court may say I'm not able to make my own decision, or a doctor may say this person can't make their own decisions anymore. Having my power of attorney already in place is a very strong tool so that I know the people I want to make decisions for me will be the ones doing that substitute decision making. A practical application for this is when someone has capacity at some times and not at other times. I mean, this is a silly example of my kid is getting sleepier and he's not going to be making decisions close to bedtime, but very common. There are individuals and kids that have good days and bad days, and if I'm worried that my child or someone I support is going to be going through a period where they're not able to make their own decisions, I'm going to strongly encourage them to make sure they have their power of attorney and a power of attorney that's up to date. So that if at any point someone says you can't make your own decisions, the person they want is going to be the one making decisions for them. As with any option, the pros and cons, this allows a person to keep their decision making authority until they're no longer able to make decisions. You can write your power of attorney so that both you and your attorney in fact, your chooser, are making decisions in certain circumstances, but this is most critical for when I'm no longer going to be able to make decisions. um, I get to keep making those decisions up until the exact moment that the doctors or court say I can't make decisions. That's very powerful as opposed to a guardianship where I'm not making any decisions anymore on my own. This also allows for the decision making process to be planned in advance. It's not suddenly a crisis. So again, for me, I'm working on my own power of attorney and updating it so that if something happens, I'll be ready and my family will be ready. It would be very difficult if I didn't plan in advance for them to just kind of guess what I wanted. Powers of attorney are historically used. They're much more common than supported decision making, which is a relatively new term, although I would argue we've been doing it for a long time. So when you go to a court and talk about a power of attorney, it's going to be recognized. If you bring it to a medical professional, they should recognize it, although I've represented people before where that was not the case. People are just a little bit more familiar with power of attorney than supported decision making as of 2025. And the power of attorney, while it's not as flexible as supported decision making, is certainly more flexible than other options in that as long as you have your own decision making capacity, you can change what's in there. You can determine what decisions your power of attorney, your chooser, is going to make. And you can change your power of attorney by starting over, getting it signed and notarized again as a best practice. Um, Whereas under a guardianship, that would be very difficult to do. And powers of attorney can be revoked relatively easily. There are some cons as well, in that your power of attorney can be limited by your triggering event. If you want people to make decisions for you, they're not going to be able to do that depending on the way that you write your power of attorney until you are unable to make your own decision. You're probably going to want to have an attorney to assist you in drafting a power of attorney because you want to make sure that it says exactly what you think it says. I've been working lately on a plain language power of attorney document because individuals that I've worked with, and frankly, me reading the standard language that Missouri includes on its power of attorney form, it's just legalese. It doesn't mean anything to me. So you're going to want someone that's an expert, and this is what I do for a living. I sit down, read over that language, determine what it means, and then I can assist you in understanding what you're actually signing off on when you draft your power of attorney, so it does what you want it to. And then another con would be that it does require planning in advance for an unknown future. You can only anticipate so many things. And trust me, I imagine all sorts of different scenarios in the future, but I can't imagine every possible thing that might occur. So, power of attorney can plan for the future, but it can't plan for everything. With the bottom line being that power of attorneys are a good tool if you can make your own decisions now, but you're worried about someone taking away your decision making capacity, whether that's doctors or the court in the future. This is a good way to plan in advance when you have someone else that you trust to make decisions for you in that circumstance. Next, we're going to be talking about guardianship and limited guardianship. Um, to begin with, limited guardianship, you're getting the court involved at this point. The court is coming in, looking over at an individual and saying, this person cannot make decisions in a specific area. The by and far, in my experience, most common one of these is medical decision making. If a court looks at a person and says they can make a lot of their own decisions, but they forget to take their meds or they refuse to get treatment, they don't understand treatment that they need, a court may impose a limited guardianship for medical decision making. Here, when the court is getting involved, they're talking again in legalese about a ward. That's the legal term in Missouri for an individual that's determined to be incapable of making some decisions. I will tell you that's a very controversial term in the disability community. A lot of people really do not like the term ward at all, but that's what our statutes say in Missouri. So that's why I use that term. And so, if we're using, for example, this medical limited guardianship, then the guardian would make all of the healthcare decisions for that person. The guardian would be whoever the court chooses to make those decisions, which is usually a family member, or if no one in the family is available, it could be a friend, and frequently ends up being the guardian of last resort, which is the public administrator, an official in your county that's in charge of making decisions for potentially hundreds of people, certainly in the St. Louis area. For a practical example, one way that I see most common on the next slide is when a person needs medicine to function, but just continues to refuse medication or stops or forgets to take their medication. The court may be worried about that and decide this person needs a limited guardian to make sure that they make the appropriate medical decisions for themselves. The pros of limited guardianship are that it does allow for some personal choice. It's only taking away decision making in a specific area. It's recognized by third parties on the courts much more easily if you need some kind of formal recognition of somebody's decision making capacity. And there's a little bit less stress on a limited guardian as opposed to a full guardian, although a limited guardian is still going to have all the kind of legal requirements of taking care of an individual and filing with the court each year. But there are a lot of cons as well. The authority of the guardian can be a little bit confusing when it's a limited guardianship. This at this point we're going to be talking about attorneys. There are going to be you're going to be in court, you're going to have someone arguing for the individual, for whoever their guardian is, potentially a third person who's arguing for the best interests. So here you're really involved in the court system. And with any kind of guardianship, including limited guardianship, it can be very difficult to end. Once you get involved in that court system, that's going to go on for a really long time. And a lot of my work as an attorney is assisting people getting out of guardianships, even when their guardian agrees, even when their doctor agrees. It can be a years long process to end that guardianship and allow that person to make their own decisions again. So that's something I warn people of, and why we try to look at guardianship as a last resort, even limited guardianship, because it's so difficult to get out of that system. The bottom line being that limited guardianship is a good option when someone absolutely needs assistance in a specific area, but is able to make decisions in another area. Lastly, we have full guardianship. I don't remember which slides I've necessarily included in this presentation, but here is my son with Bubba. That's his favorite stuffed animal, Lovey toy, and Bubba is with him always. It's not a perfect analogy for guardianship, but a guardian is when an individual has someone making decisions for them and isn't making any of their own decisions. On the next slide, legally, this is a relationship between the individual, which is called a ward, the court appointed guardian, which is the person making decisions, and the probate court where they're located. Now, you may or may not have dealt with probate courts before. The main thing that they do is deal with estates when someone passes away and distributing money and things like that. For some courts, guardianship does not come up very often. In St. Louis and St. Louis City, fortunately, the judges and commissioners are a little bit more familiar with what that actually means. But certainly, you're going to be dealing with court and attorneys and the whole legal process at that point. And this can be very confusing for everyone involved. Even attorneys that don't practice in this area get confused the first times they're dipping into guardianship. Depending on how exactly they're appointed, guardians are responsible to their ward for a lot of things, almost everything. But here's just a brief list. They have to act in the best interests of the ward. They have to get medical care, and they have to ensure that the ward is comfortable, healthy, safe, and secure. They have to ensure the ward has appropriate housing. That it means that they're housed in the least restrictive, appropriate environment, which means if you're a guardian for someone that can live in the community or live in their own home, you're making sure that happens instead of them living in a nursing home or a communal setting. Or if they are living in a communal setting, you're making sure that it's not too restrictive for what things that they can do. You're in charge of providing consents on behalf of the ward. You're going to be filling out a lot of all the paperwork you fill out for yourself. You're going to be doing it for that person as well. And there is an additional requirement that the guardian has to report a status annually to the court, which again, you're going to be advised to have an attorney that you're working with if you're going to be dealing with that system as well. So you'll recognize this is a lot of decisions that normally an individual would be making for themselves, but suddenly the guardian is making all of these. Where the person lives, whether they can get married, some things that are very personal. If you're getting married or not, I don't usually think about getting someone's permission, that my mom's permission or my guardian's permission to do that. Usually that's between me and the person I want to marry. But when you're in a guardianship, it's more complicated. Whether I'm going to work, where I'm going to work, whether I can vote or not. The guardian isn't going to vote for you or something like that, but the court is going to decide if you have the capacity and understanding to be able to vote. Who you're going to associate with. This frequently comes up with guardians that think someone is a bad influence on another person's life. So you're going to be restricted from getting to decide even who you associate with and whether you're going to enter into a contract, what kind of medical care you're going to get, which doctor you're going to have, all very personal decisions. So you can see again why this would kind of be a last resort for individuals because you're really giving away so many decisions that a lot of us take for granted in our lives. Now, there are significant advantages when guardianship is needed because it allows guardians to make those decisions without worrying about what the individual is unable to make those decisions. They're ready to go. You don't need to uh, consult with other people. You just show your guardianship paperwork to a doctor and say, okay, I'm consenting to this surgery. It allows access to medical records. You're not going to have to fill out releases in the same way that you would with the other forms. And it is respected by third parties who know what guardianship is. A lot of places are familiar with it. It comes with a pretty hefty price, though, because it doesn't allow for an individual to make their own decisions or benefit from a lot of the health benefits that we discussed earlier of making your own decisions. It's generally going to require attorneys. You're going to be in front of a court. You're going to have to argue about what decisions a person can or can't make. I will say that process can be very contentious for families and their loved ones when they don't agree about their ability to make decisions. And that process I won't go over too thoroughly, but there are a lot of different things that go into that. And as we discussed with limited guardianship, it's very difficult to end a guardianship, even in the best of circumstances. So, a full guardianship is a good option for people who have really extreme limitations and can't make decisions for themselves in most aspects of their life. I would still encourage uh, individuals um, and guardians for when an individual's in a guardianship to practice decision making because it is possible to get restored and it is possible for people to benefit from whatever decisions they can make in their own lives. So whenever I work with people under guardianship, I say this isn't the end of your life. You can still continue working and learning skills to be able to make your own decisions. And I encourage everyone that's involved in the guardianship system to keep working that way, to make whatever decisions are appropriate. So, again, we talked about it a little bit, but I want to be clear that the difference between a full guardianship and a limited guardianship is for a full guardianship, the guardian has full authority over pretty much all life areas. And in a limited guardianship, they're only having control over a specific aspect of their life. There's one other term on the next page which we should talk about, conservatorship. A conservatorship is when, again, you're in court, but it's essentially a guardianship for financial decision making. A conservator is a person that controls the finances for an individual when they're not able to make decisions about their own money. So if you hear somebody talking about conservatorship in other states, in California, that's just their word for guardianship. For the whole Britney Spears case, we were hearing that. But in the state of Missouri, conservatorship just means control over an individual's financial decision making. On the next slide, it's going to ask about whether these options are appropriate or not. And this, again, is a very individualized determination. They should only be imposed if the person doesn't have the ability to handle their own affairs, to make their own decisions due to their disability. And it should never be done solely on the basis of a specific diagnosis, an IQ score, or a physical limitation. I have seen some really important cases in this area where an individual was diagnosed and had, for example, a really low IQ score on some testing. And unfortunately, some medical professionals looked at that individual and said, I don't think she's ever going to be able to make her own decisions. And we were really able, as attorneys and the court system, to get involved with individuals. I encourage you to look up who I'm thinking of right now is Jenny Hatch. Was an individual who was able to get the attorney to bring her to the doctor to discuss how she makes decisions in her own life. And after meeting with her, her doctor was immediately on board and was like, actually, she can make all of her own decisions. And I rushed to a hasty judgment based on this diagnosis and IQ score. So that's the reason I bring this up. It can be very scary or difficult to believe that a person that I'm caring for is going to be able to make their own decision if I see a specific diagnosis, but everybody should be met where they are. And just because an individual has one specific diagnosis or condition, that doesn't mean they can't make their own decisions. We really need to drill down and determine what I can and can't decide for who I am. For practicing decision making, and I think we're getting towards the end of our presentation here. I would encourage when an individual, even if they're already under a guardianship, to work on practicing decisions. If you're working with your child who's turning 14, 16, 17, 18, you can practice in the ways that we discussed before, using small amounts of money, making decisions with supervision. So if you're making an important decision and there really does need to be a fail-safe there, you can have that in place. And experiencing and understanding consequences. I'm a firm believer that if I never experience consequences for my bad decisions, I'll never learn to stop making bad decisions. And finally, I would encourage again to look at the documents that we've looked at today, supported decision making agreements, and see just some of the different areas where we make decisions in our own life that you might not even think about that these are decisions. And these are things that we can do because we're not under guardianship. And it can be very difficult to get out of, which is the last slide here is the restoration of guardianship. It's not impossible, but it is very difficult. It's going to be up to the court and not the guardian whether someone's guardianship is going to be restored, and you're very likely going to need attorneys to be able to restore guardianship. Although I'd encourage anyone that's in a guardianship and thinks that they have a chance to work with the court to get better, to develop decision-making skills, and then ultimately terminate that guardianship, it's worth going through the process. Here are some other resources. This first is the Supported Decision Making Consortium, which I'm a part of. I'm aware that the special school districts' computers may not be able to access this website. I made the website myself. I'm not a web designer, so it's not the prettiest thing ever, but it just has resources that are Missouri specific for getting started with supported decision making and understanding what that looks like for me, my family, or me as a professional. Then there are a lot of other great resources out there nationally at supporteddecisionmaking.org. There are far too many for me to read in my life. It's an amazing resource. The Missouri Family to Family Resource Center and the Life Course Nexus, which we looked at a couple of their tools earlier. You should always feel free to reach out to me and my organization, which is Missouri Protection and Advocacy, at any of these contacts. And I'm happy to answer any questions I can, or even if you apply to our organization to take cases, because I love working on supported decision making and any alternatives to guardianship that I can to help people live your best lives and make decisions to the maximum of your ability. So thank you so much for having me present today. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
So I'm going to